The train hissed like a rattlesnake, steam curling into the brittle air, as if it too wanted to vanish into the high desert sky. Wind swept across the platform, slicing through Nolan Yazzi's coat and chilling the back of his neck, but he didn't flinch. He kept his gloved hands steady on the metal rims of his wheelchair, unmoving, staring straight ahead at the woman who had just carved his dignity from him with a single look. She hadn't even needed to raise her voice. "I needed a man who can stand," she'd said flatly, like she was commenting on the weather. "Not this." Nolan had braced for a lot of things when he got off that train. A cold reception, maybe awkward curiosity. But he hadn't been ready for the silence that followed her rejection. Dozens of strangers turning their heads away, pretending not to have heard, as if their averted eyes would protect him from shame. Rebecca Crowley's boots had clicked across the wooden planks of the platform with hard finality. As she walked away, the long red scarf she wore fluttering behind her like a drawn line between her and the man she refused to claim. He hadn't moved since. He wouldn't not until that train left. Not because he was still hoping she'd change her mind, but because walking away now, rolling away, would feel too much like admitting she was right. He could hear the conductor behind him calling last boarding for Gallup, last call. The engine hissed again. Another gust of wind sent a tumble of dust and paper spiraling down the platform. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and fell silent. A child cried out, was hushed. Nolan let the cold burn against his face. It anchored him, reminded him that he was still here, still alive, still not leaving. "I didn't come here asking for mercy," he murmured under his breath. "I came here to work." He bent forward slightly, arms pushing on the wheels. The chair groaned a little as he moved, an old sound, familiar and worn like the rest of him. He turned, wheeling away from the train and toward the opposite end of the platform. His bag packed tight with every tool he owned, and the last bits of his money waited where the conductor had left it. A man stood there. Tall, thick-shouldered in a blacksmith's apron stained with coal and iron. He hadn't moved the entire time Nolan had sat there, nor spoken, just watched. Nolan met his eyes as he approached. "Need something?" Nolan asked. The man jerked his chin toward the spot where the ramp met the edge of the platform. "Saw the way that one wobbled under your weight. Could give way on someone lighter than you. Dangerous. I noticed. You gonna fix it if I can get the right boards?" The man gave a slow nod. "Shed out back of the station's unlocked. You break something, you fix it." "Fair enough." Nolan wheeled toward the side of the station, finding the maintenance shed unlocked, just as the man said. The scent of cut pine rust and dried mule sweat hit him the moment he pushed the door open. He found lumber nails and a handsaw that had clearly seen better days. He worked in silence, focused. Measure, cut, anchor. His gloves grew stiff in the cold, and the heels of his palms ached from pushing down the nails. He reinforced the weak section of the ramp, angled it better to meet the gravel path, added bracing to keep it from swaying under pressure. By the time he was finished, the train was gone, leaving nothing but a thin ribbon of smoke curling behind distant hills. He tested the new ramp twice. Once down, once up. It held. When he turned back toward the platform, the blacksmith was still there, arms folded, pipe in hand. "You know brake systems?" the man asked without preamble. "Some. Why freight wagon in my shop's got a brake that locks up whenever the temperature drops. Been meaning to fix it, but I'm better with horseshoes than levers." Nolan considered the question. "I'd have to see it first." "Pay you $2 if you fix it right. Name's Ben Toe, shop's down the main road across from the granary." Nolan nodded. "Nolan Yazzie. I'll come by tomorrow." Ben gave a grunt that might have meant approval, then walked off without another word. Nolan turned back toward his bag. As he slung it onto his lap, the full weight of the day finally settled into his chest. His shoulders slumped. The cold had bitten through to his bones, and the ache from his lower back, the spot where his spine simply stopped responding, throbbed as it always did when the temperature dropped. He didn't regret staying, not yet. But the air here was sharper than Denver's, the silence heavier. There was no one here who knew him, no friend waiting in a warm kitchen, no girl whose smile softened the way people stared. He didn't need any of that. What he needed was a roof for the night, and enough coin for bread come morning. Wheeling off the platform, he passed through town slowly. The dirt roads had turned to frozen ruts. Wagons rolled by drivers barely glancing his way. Children stared openly. A woman carrying a baby crossed the street before he could pass. He didn't blame them. He'd lived with this chair long enough to know it wasn't just his legs they saw, it was everything they imagined it meant. Weakness, burden, misfortune. The boarding house sat 2 streets over a long adobe building with a sign hand-painted in both English and Dene. The front steps loomed like a dare. Nolan went around back. A small woman in her late 50s opened the service door before he could knock twice. Her gray hair was pulled back tight and her eyes were sharper than glass. "No charity," she said flatly. "No drunks, no cooking in rooms. You're late, you missed breakfast. I'll pay for 3 days up front." She held out her hand. Aylin Begay. Nolan Yazzie. She nodded, counted the money and stepped aside. "Rooms in the back, no stairs. That's the only one." He wheeled past her into the dim hallway, the air thick with wood smoke and lye. As she led him to the room, she glanced once at the chair. "You came on the train today," she said. "Yes. That woman Crowley, she's a fool." "I know." Mrs. Begay stopped at the door and turned to face him squarely. "You planning to stay? I'm planning to work. Same thing around here." She opened the door and left without another word. Nolan sat in silence. The room was barely bigger than a storage closet, with a thin bed, a single table, and a window that faced the back alley. The plaster walls were cracked. The floor had no rug, but the roof didn't leak and the door locked. That was enough. He rolled to the window and looked out. Far across the yard, smoke curled from a chimney. A woman with a basket on her hip, laundry by the look of it, moved down the street toward the trading post. Behind her trailed a girl, maybe 9, walking with a limp and a worn crutch. Neither of them looked his way. But they would. They all would. If I leave now, Nolan thought, they'll be right about me forever. He stood, or rather sat, on the edge of that thought the next morning, staring out the narrow window of his room as light crept cautiously into the alley behind the boarding house. The frost had etched delicate veins across the glass, and for a while he just watched them melt slowly under the breath of the rising sun. The ache in his shoulders hadn't eased. Sleep had come in patches, but rest had not. His body was tired, but his mind refused to lie still. Rebecca Crowley's voice echoed in the hollow space between his ears, not loud, but sharp words like "not whole" and "can't stand" slicing through the thin fabric of yesterday's resolve. And yet here he was, still in Fort Defiance, still in the chair, still not on the train. The mattress creaked as he shifted his weight, pulling his coat over the stiff muscles in his arms and shoulders. The wheels of his chair squeaked faintly as he backed away from the table where his bag sat still half-packed from the night before. He'd considered leaving, thought about it every hour that passed. He could still roll back to the station, ask the conductor when the next train to Gallup or Albuquerque passed through. He had just enough cash left if he skipped meals. But something about the idea of leaving burned hotter than the humiliation had. He hadn't come here to be accepted. He'd come here to be useful. And useful he would be. He wheeled into the hallway, the boards creaking beneath him as he made his way toward the kitchen. The scent of coffee and frying fat drifted out along with the clink of plates and the low murmur of conversation. As he pushed through the doorway, the talking stopped for just a moment. 4 other boarders sat at the long table. 2 men who looked like cattle drivers, a woman in a mended calico dress, and a younger fellow with soot-streaked hands, probably worked for the railroad or the smithy. Their eyes flicked to him, then away again, returning to their plates, like they hadn't paused at all. Mrs. Begay was already there with the coffee. She didn't speak, just poured a cup and set it in front of him. Then a plate, 2 eggs, fried potatoes, and a dense biscuit that looked like it might chip a tooth, but would keep him going until evening. "Eat. You'll need it," she said. He did. After breakfast, Nolan wheeled down the main street, his breath fogging in front of him, each roll of the wheels sending crunches through the packed dirt and ice underfoot. His gloves were already stiff by the time he reached the corner where the station sat. The ramp he'd built still stood intact and solid, though it bore the faint mark of someone else's boots. A good sign. He turned left toward the smithy, passing under the awning of a shuttered dry goods store. Behind him, someone muttered something under their breath. He didn't turn to catch the words. He didn't need to. Ben Toe's smithy sat low and wide, a squat adobe and timber structure that crouched at the edge of town like it had grown there with the desert. The wide double doors stood open, the heat from inside rolling out into the frozen morning like breath from a giant. Hammer strikes rang like bells as Nolan approached, crisp and rhythmic. Ben didn't look up when Nolan rolled in. The big man was bent over, a glowing horseshoe, sweat gleaming on his brow despite the cold outside. He plunged the shoe into water, steam rising in a hiss, then finally turned. "You showed. You offered work. I don't waste that." Ben grunted and gestured toward the back of the shop. A freight wagon sat with one rear wheel removed, the exposed axle glinting with grease and dirt. "Breaks the problem," Ben said. "Locks up when the temperature drops. Makes it useless on hills." Nolan wheeled closer, studying the mechanism. Standard lever system, friction pad against the hub. The pivot looked bent, and moisture had likely built up around the joint, freezing overnight. Someone had tried oiling it, which made it worse in the cold. "Needs to come apart," Nolan said. "Cleaned, reset, and powdered. Got graphite somewhere," Ben said. "Tools are yours. I'll be at the forge." He got to work. His hands remembered the motions easily, dismantling the brake, cleaning the rusted points, filing away the burrs that had formed from neglect. He hammered the lever back into true shape against the corner of Ben's anvil, careful not to strain the metal, then reassembled the whole thing with slow precision. 2 hours passed. The forge sang in the background. Horses snorted and stamped in the holding pens. No one spoke. When Nolan finally rolled back and signaled for Ben, the blacksmith came over and tested the brake. Once, twice, then harder. It moved like silk. "How'd you know to use graphite? Oil holds water. Graphite doesn't freeze." Ben's face didn't shift much, but his nod was more than polite, it was approving. He reached into his pocket and handed over 2 coins. "Fair pay," he said. Nolan took the money, feeling the press of cold metal in his palm. "I've got other work," Ben said after a moment. "Tools that need sharpening, wagon wheels to repair. Not much, but steady. You'd work out of here. Use what I've got. Keep your own side pay." Nolan paused. The offer was simple, honest. But then Ben added, "People might not like it, I figured. They won't say it to your face, not right away. But you'll hear it, I already have." Ben squinted at him. "You planning to stay?" Nolan looked past the open doors out at the street. A wagon rumbled by. Across the way, he saw a girl with dark hair and a slight limp moving slowly behind a woman carrying a heavy basket. The girl paused when she saw him. She didn't smile. She just watched. "I'm planning to work," Nolan said. "Same thing around here." Ben stepped back and nodded once more. "Start tomorrow. Early." Nolan wheeled out of the smithy and turned toward the boarding house. His arms ached from the work, but a different kind of ache stirred in his chest. Now one that didn't come from shame or fatigue, but from something heavier. Possibility. He passed by the general store but didn't stop. The man inside hadn't met his eyes when he entered town. No reason to expect he would now. Still, Nolan noticed how the curtain twitched in the window as he rolled past. He kept going. When he turned the corner near the trading post, he heard the voice again. A girl's laughter, bright and sharp like wind through dry leaves. He saw her same girl as before, the one with the limp. She was stepping carefully over a pile of frozen laundry water spilled from a bucket. The woman beside her said something in Dene voice, scolding, but not unkind. The girl looked back, eyes darting to Nolan again. This time she offered him something faint and unexpected. A smile. He didn't smile back. Not yet. But he felt it linger behind his ribs the rest of the way home. Sometimes the ones with the deepest wounds are the ones who build the strongest bridges. The next day dawned with less frost, but more wind. It whipped down from the mesas, tugging at Nolan's coat as he made his way from the boarding house to the smithy. He leaned forward in the chair, keeping his gloves tight on the wheels, his eyes narrowed against the dust dancing in the air. His shoulders were sore from the day before, but not unbearably, so there was something different about working a day and having it count for something. Inside the shop, Ben was already heating the forge. Sparks bloomed in the shadows like fireflies, and the hammer rang out across the dry morning. "I left you the spokeshave and the grindstone," Ben said without looking up. "Wheel rim needs truing. Someone hit a rock full speed and thought they could just keep riding." Nolan nodded and rolled to the tools, already pulling the battered wheel toward him. The rim was cracked along one edge, but salvageable. He ran his hands along the warped wood, pressing and tilting until he found the exact point of impact. He'd just started shaving the edges clean when a soft voice spoke behind him. "You're the man from the station, the one with the clever hands." He turned. A young woman stood near the doorway, one hand resting on the frame like she needed the support. She wore a wide skirt and a shawl woven in desert hues. Her hair was thick black, braided neatly down her back. Her eyes, though those eyes held stories, shadows and flickers of light like river stones catching sun. Nolan didn't speak at first. The sound of the forge hissed between them, punctuated by Ben's steady hammering. "I remember you," she said gently. "You fixed the ramp," my mother noticed. "You were watching," he said. The corners of her mouth lifted slightly. "We all were. Fort Defiance doesn't get many men who don't look like they belong." He raised an eyebrow. "And you look like you came here to stay even if no one asked you to." He blinked, unsure what to say. She stepped closer, offering her hand. "My name's Tala. My mother, Alice Yazzie, runs the trading post. She sent me to see if Ben could repair a kettle, but he's busy hammering some poor soul's luck back into shape. So I thought I'd say hello instead." He took her hand. Her grip was light but steady. "Nolan Blackfeather. A Dene name, my father's tribe. My mother was half Irish. Didn't get to learn much before he passed." She nodded thoughtfully. "That happens a lot. Names left behind. Stories lost. I'm trying to build a new one," he said quietly. "One that stays." She looked at him, and in that moment Nolan saw she wasn't just polite. She understood. "We could use more builders," she said. "Of things. Of people." Tala stayed while he worked. She watched with quiet curiosity, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just observing. When the kettle repair was done and Ben took it inside, she lingered. "Do you ever feel angry?" she asked suddenly. "At the chair, at your legs." He didn't answer right away. The question wasn't cruel, but it wasn't small either. "Yes," he said finally. "But it doesn't help. Anger's like a broken spoke, throws the whole thing off balance if you keep spinning it too long." She seemed to weigh that, then nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. "Would you come to the Post sometime?" she asked. "We've got a back room where folks share news and drink cedar tea. You might meet people who matter here." "I thought I'd already met one," he replied. She flushed slightly and left without another word, the bell above the smithy door jingling in her wake. By the time Nolan returned to the boarding house that evening, the wind had settled, but whispers had not. A few glances followed him down the hallway, and Mrs. Begay raised an eyebrow as she handed him his supper. "You made friends fast," she said. He shrugged, poking at the stew. "I fix what's broken. She's a good girl, that one. Smart. Honest. The kind who sees more than most, I noticed." Mrs. Begay paused. "But she's also Alice Yazzie only daughter. Folks watch who she speaks to. I didn't start it." "No," she said. "But you didn't stop it either." That night, Nolan sat by the window watching shadows stretch across the desert. Something warm buzzed beneath his ribs, but he didn't know if it was pride, danger, or both. The next few days passed in steady rhythm. Ben's shop had more work than expected: wagons, spokes, hinges, plow blades. Nolan took to each task with care, never rushing, never cutting corners. His work spoke louder than he did, and people noticed. A farmer brought in a broken scythe. A mother asked if he could mend a tin toy. Even the preacher, stiff-backed and suspicious, at first nodded at him after Sunday service, but whispers still clung to corners. "Mail order cripple," someone muttered near the well. "He'll leave when the money runs dry. He's just buying time, looking for pity." Nolan ignored most of it, but one comment spoken low by a ranch hand passing the smithy stuck in his chest like a burr. "He ain't a real man. Can't even stand on his own 2 feet." That night, Nolan didn't eat. He sat at the table with his hands clenched, staring at the knuckles until the skin turned white. "You're building something," Mrs. Begay said softly. "That scares people." "I'm not trying to be a symbol," he muttered. "You don't have to be. Just be steady." The wind howls loudest before it dies down. The following morning, he went to the trading post. The front room was quiet, filled with woven blankets, handmade jewelry, dried herbs in clay jars. Tala stood behind the counter, arranging beads by color. When she saw him, her smile was quick. "You came." "I said I would." She motioned to the back. He followed her into a dim room with 2 benches and a low table. On it sat a pot of cedar tea steaming gently and a tin of dried peaches. Tala poured for them both. They sipped in silence. "People are saying things," she said after a while. "I know. I've heard worse. So have I." She turned to him, her eyes deep and still. "You're not just here to fix wagons, are you?" "No," he said. "I'm here to fix what I became after the war, or maybe to figure out what's left of me that's still worth saving." "You already saved part of yourself by coming," she said. "Now let the rest unfold." He reached for another sip of tea, the warmth flowing down into the hollows that had been cold too long. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the edge of the post's awning. But for the first time in a long while, Nolan didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to be pitied. I came to be worthy of standing beside someone, even if I never stand again." The barn behind the trading post smelled of cedar shavings and hay. Dust drifted through narrow slats in the wood, painting the morning light in gold and gray. Nolan grunted as he hoisted himself from his chair into the makeshift saddle brace he'd been working on for days. The leather straps bit into his palms, but he welcomed the sting. It was real, it was earned. Every rope he tightened, every metal loop he filed down, meant another inch closer to reclaiming something people assumed he'd lost forever. Tala watched from the barn door, arms crossed loosely over her chest. Stubborn, she murmured mostly to herself. Was that encouragement? He asked, half smiling. I'm just making sure you don't fall and crack your head open. Hard to court a man with brains spilling all over the barn floor. He chuckled but didn't look up. Concentration burned in his brow as he adjusted the final strap around the post and leaned into the rig. This wasn't just about horses. It was about proving something first to the town, then to himself. He wasn't just a man in a chair. He was a man with purpose, with weight, with hands that built, and a heart that endured. The mare he'd been training. Juniper snorted and shuffled her hooves. She was young, dark-eyed, still unsure of him, but not mean. Nolan reached out slowly, brushing her mane with calm fingers, whispering low so she wouldn't spook. I'm not broken, he said softly to the horse. Just made different. Juniper blinked and leaned into his touch. Tala stepped closer now, quiet. My father was a silversmith, she said. When his hands started to shake, people said he should give it up, that he'd embarrass himself. He kept making things. Slower, not always perfect, but more meaningful. He sounded like someone I would have liked. You remind me of him, she said. Nolan adjusted the rig again, and with one smooth motion hoisted himself into the saddle brace he had designed to cradle his lower back and hips. The pulley above creaked, but held. Juniper turned her head wide-eyed, but didn't bolt. For the first time since the war, Nolan sat astride a horse. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with something deeper. Pride, memory, longing, easy girl, he whispered as Juniper shifted beneath him. Tala moved beside the mare, her hand steady on the reins. I'll walk with you. They circled the small corral together slowly. Dust rose in soft puffs beneath Juniper's hooves. Nolan held the reins loosely, not trying to control her too much, just trying to feel the rhythm, remember the language of motion and balance. A few townsfolk gathered near the fence, drawn by the murmurs. Old Tom, the livery owner. Clara and June from the weaving shop. Even Alice Yazzie stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, expression unreadable. Nolan saw the questions in their eyes. What's he trying to prove? Does he think this makes him whole? He didn't look away. After a second pass, Juniper stopped near the gate. Nolan exhaled, heart thudding. I didn't fall, he said. More than that, Tala replied. You rose? The moment broke when Tom cleared his throat. You fix wagons. Now you ride. What's next? Running races, laughter rippled not unkind, but unsure. Nolan met his gaze. I didn't come here to be pitied. I came to be worthy of standing beside someone even if I never stand again. Tom's smile faded. Fair enough. Back in the barn, Nolan dismounted slowly, his arms shaking from the effort. Tala helped lower him back into the chair. Sweat streaked his face, but his eyes burned with something brighter than fatigue. Later that day, he sat in the back room of the trading post with a mug of lukewarm cedar tea, fingers aching from the ride, but heart alive. Tala entered her shawl, sliding from one shoulder. I think they see you differently now. I'm not looking for their permission. No, she said. But maybe you've earned their respect. Alice entered then, quiet as a whisper. She glanced between them before setting down a small leather pouch on the table. For the repairs you did to the post last week, she said. It was just a new hinge and door frame. It meant our door didn't swing open in the storm. That matters more than you think. He nodded, not sure how to accept gratitude from someone so fiercely guarded. Alice hesitated. My daughter speaks highly of you, but I'd be wrong not to remind you this town doesn't forget easily. I'm not here to make anyone forget, he said, just to live like I belong. She gave a curt nod and left. Tala looked down at the pouch and then up at him, smile soft. Small steps, she said. That evening, Nolan wheeled himself along the ridge outside town where the wind curled between boulders and the sky stretched wide enough to hold all his doubts. He watched the sunset bleed across the land copper rust flame colors that didn't ask permission to be beautiful. He thought of his past, the war, the hospital, the silence that followed. And now this strange, stubborn town where he was learning to be something more than a memory. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice, gruff, deliberate. You planning on starting a riding school? Nolan turned. A tall man stood a few feet away, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder, the brim of his hat shadowing sharp eyes. Depends on who's asking. Name's Clay Morgan. Run cattle past the ridge. Heard about the fellow with wheels trying to ride horses. Nolan held his gaze. You here to laugh? No, Clay said. I'm here because I might need a wheelwright, one who's not afraid to get dirty. Nolan raised an eyebrow. That an offer? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just seeing if the rumors are true. Which ones, that the man who came in a chair has more spine than half the ranchers around here? They stood in silence, two men framed by dusk, measuring something unspoken. Clay tipped his hat. See you around Blackfeather. The wind picked up again as Nolan watched him go. His hands rested on the worn arms of his chair, fingers curled loosely. Small steps, but each one took him further from who he had been and closer to who he might become. You can build 100 things and people will still only see the one thing you can't do. But it's what you do anyway that writes your name in this dirt. Nolan adjusted the leather brace along the length of his thigh, tightening it just enough to hold his legs still without cutting off circulation. The morning light sliced through the slats in the barn roof, and already the air shimmered with the coming heat. He wiped the sweat from his brow and reached for his chisel again. The wheel of the old wagon axle resting beside him, like a patient beast waiting to be tamed. It was his third job this week, repairs for the Morgan Ranch. Clay hadn't been joking when he offered work, and it wasn't charity either. The man expected grit and delivered only silence in return. Nolan liked that about him. No questions, just sweat wood and steel. You planning to eat today? Tala's voice rang out from the doorway. Nolan looked up. She held a plate of fry bread and beans wrapped in cloth. Her eyes narrowed like a mother hen's, but her mouth betrayed the faintest curve of amusement. Eventually, he said, Can't let the axle win. You already beat it into submission yesterday. That was the wheel hub. This is the axle shaft. She crossed the barn, crouched beside him, and set the plate down. You know most folks would have quit after the first callus. He glanced at her. Most folks haven't had to prove they belong. Maybe they should. They sat in silence for a few breaths, the kind that stretched gently without needing to be filled. Then a clatter of hooves echoed outside the barn, sharp and fast. Nolan turned toward the sound, just as Clay Morgan stepped inside his boots, heavy with red dust. Got another job, Clay said without preamble. Wainwright's mill lost a wheel in the gulch. Can't haul timber without it. I'll take it, Nolan said immediately, before he even registered the tightness in his shoulders. The gulch wasn't flat land. It would mean rough trails, uneven ground risk. Clay seemed to weigh him, then gave a slight nod. You'll need help. I've got help, Nolan said, jerking his chin toward Tala. Clay didn't flinch. I meant muscle. A voice chimed in from the back of the barn. Then you've got me. It was Roy Tenbears, the old blacksmith who once called Nolan deadweight with good eyes. He stood with arms folded, his dark braid tucked into his vest. You sure? Nolan asked, eyes narrowing with surprise. I hate being wrong, Roy grumbled. And I hate a broken axle more. That afternoon, the three men made their way into the gulch. The path was rugged, strewn with rocks and cactus clusters. Nolan's custom-built wheels handled the trail better than expected, though every jolt sent fire through his spine. He kept silent. The wagon had fallen sideways near the edge of a wash, one wheel sunken deep into a split in the rock. The damage was worse than Clay described. The axle-cracked spokes snapped like dry bones. Roy squatted beside it. This'll take hours, then we better start. Nolan reached for his brace locks. The sun dipped low while they worked. Sweat dripped from Roy's temples. Clay hauled the broken timbers up the ridge. Nolan sketched the wheel layout in the dust with a stick, issuing instructions with crisp precision. At some point, Roy grunted approval. That was more than Nolan expected. Who taught you this? Roy finally asked as the spokes began to take shape. My uncle Nolan replied. Back in the Nations, he was part Choctaw, part blacksmith, full stubborn. You got all three parts, Roy muttered. By the time they secured the wheel to the wagon, dusk had fallen and coyotes howled in the distance. You didn't quit, Clay said, nodding toward Nolan's bruised hands. Didn't plan to. As they packed up, Roy handed Nolan a flask. You'll never get everyone to see past your chair. Some don't want to. But folks'll remember what you fixed when nothing else worked. Nolan took a sip and handed it back. You can build 100 things, and people will still only see the one thing you can't do. But it's what you do anyway that writes your name in this dirt. They rode back under starlight, the sky so wide it swallowed every wound whole. Back in town, Nolan rolled past the shuttered shops. He stopped outside the trading post, surprised to see Tala still sweeping the porch. You're late, she said, eyeing his blistered fingers. Made it back, he answered. She stepped closer and held out her hand. Let me see. He hesitated, then placed his palm in hers. She wrapped it with a cool cloth soaked in arnica and something that smelled of sweetgrass. You don't have to bleed to matter. Feels like the only way they'll believe me. Maybe, she said. Or maybe you're showing them something they didn't know they needed to see. He looked up at her, the lantern above casting soft light across her cheekbones, her quiet strength. In that moment, the air between them shifted, nothing spoken but something understood. You're stubborn too, he murmured. I learned from watching. They stood like that for a long while, her hands on his, the dust of the day settling around them. Nolan's shoulders ached, but his chest felt lighter than it had in years. Inside, the fire cracked gently in the stove. The silence was no longer lonely. It was earned. And far beyond town, past the hills and the ridge, a letter lay unread in the hands of a man who had once known Nolan before he was broken. A man who had reasons to return. A man who wasn't finished with the past. Trouble never knocked. It rode. A man's past will always find him, but it's what he does when it catches up that makes him more than just what he was. The morning quiet of Arroyo Wells shattered with the rattle of hooves and the clang of a dismounted spur. Nolan paused mid-hinge repair outside the blacksmith's, a worn gate propped against his lap. He turned toward the sound and froze. The man who stepped into view was dust-coated, lean with a long coat that whispered with each stride. The sun caught the edge of a badge worn but still gleaming, and under the brim of his hat, eyes sharp as flint found Nolan's. "Didn't expect to find you here," the man said. "Thought you'd be halfway across Kansas hiding in some boxcar like the last time." Nolan's fingers tensed around the hinge. "Marshall Denton. Marshall's gone," the man said. "Retired. Just Virgil now. But I didn't retire from remembering." Tala appeared from the shop doorway, her hands covered in flour. Her eyes flicked from Nolan to the stranger and back. "Friend of yours?" "Something like that," Nolan said, never taking his eyes off Virgil. "We knew each other before I came west." Virgil stepped closer, his boots thudding against the boards. "You sure know how to vanish? One day you're testifying in federal court, the next, you disappear crippled no less. I figured you dead until someone mailed me this." He reached into his coat and pulled out a yellowed envelope, edges curled, addressed in a scrawl Nolan recognized instantly. "I never sent that," Nolan said. "I know. Your cousin did. She said you were rebuilding something. She didn't mention the chair." Tala's posture shifted, protective. Nolan exhaled. "Why are you here?" Virgil's voice dropped, no longer laced with accusation. "Because the man you put behind bars is walking free." Silence fell heavy between them. Nolan's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the surge of memory. "I testified," Nolan said. "I did what I could. And the prosecution buried your statement when you vanished. No one believed a man like you would stand up to Holt Jessup. Not after what he did to you." Nolan's jaw clenched. "I remember what he did. He's in New Mexico now, building up men like ticks on a hound. You think starting over in a new town erases it all? Men like him don't forget loose ends, especially ones that testified." Nolan looked away past the corral, past the hills, to where the land met the sky. He had come here to build, not to run again. But the past was dragging its boots right through his doorway. "I'm not who I was back then," Nolan said. Virgil stepped forward. "And I'm not asking you to be. But folks are going to get hurt if you keep your head down." Roy Tenbears rounded the corner, eyes sharp. "Something wrong here." Tala crossed her arms. Man from Nolan's past came back waving threats. Virgil lifted his hands. "Not threats. Warnings. Holt's coming. He's heard Nolan's alive and putting down roots. That means he'll want to rip them out." Roy studied Nolan. "You gonna run again?" Nolan shook his head. "No, I've run enough." Roy grunted, turned to Virgil. "Then say your piece and go." "I already have," Virgil said. "Just don't pretend it's over. You can build all the wheels in the world, it won't roll away from what's chasing you." He tipped his hat and left the dust rising behind him like a warning smoke. That night, the trading post was quiet. Tala cooked in silence, the smell of stew lingering in the air, but neither of them touched it. Nolan sat on the porch, staring at the dark. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "How bad was it? Worse than I ever let on," Nolan said. "Jessup didn't just take my legs. He tried to break something deeper." "Did he?" Nolan was silent a long while. "Then maybe. For a time. But I've learned how to build again." "Then you're stronger now than when he found you." He looked at her, really looked. The porch lamp cast shadows across her face, but her eyes were steady. "I want to believe that. You already do," she said, touching his hand gently. "You just need to act like it." A knock at the back door startled them. Roy stepped in without waiting. "Clay sent word," he said. "Strangers sniffing around the southern ranches. One asking questions about a cripple in a chair who don't know his place." Nolan's fists tightened on the armrests. "He's not waiting," Tala said. "He's already here." Roy looked at Nolan. "So what's the plan?" Nolan's voice came low and sure. We make this town unwelcoming to ghosts. Roy grinned. Thought you'd say that. Got a few tricks left in the forge. I'll talk to Clay, Tala said. We'll need every man watching the road in and out. They moved like water around him, but Nolan sat still, the weight of choice pressing into his chest. He wasn't just defending himself now, he was defending the life he'd started to believe he deserved, and the people who'd chosen to stand beside him. Later that night, alone in his room, Nolan reached for the box under his bed. Inside was the badge he'd once been given when helping Virgil take down Jessup before the ambush, before the fire, before everything changed. It was dented, burned on one edge, almost unrecognizable. He held it to the light. A man's past will always find him, but it's what he does when it catches up that makes him more than just what he was. Nolan tucked the badge into his coat pocket. Let Jessup come. This time Nolan wouldn't be the one who ran. I thought I was just the man in the chair, but I was always the wheel that kept turning. The morning sun crept across the desert, casting long shadows over Arroyo Wells. Nolan sat at the edge of the forge, staring into the iron heart of the furnace. Sparks flicked from the coals like restless spirits. He could still feel the tremble in his arms from the night before, when he'd gripped the badge in his coat pocket like it was a piece of his spine. Roy stepped up beside him, his sleeves rolled, face already damp from heat and effort. Didn't sleep, didn't try, Nolan said. Roy handed him a leather-wrapped hammer. You gonna build something, or you just gonna stare the day down? Nolan turned the hammer over in his hands, the weight familiar grounding. I need to build something I never thought I'd build again. Roy raised a brow. Armor, no. A carriage, one built for speed and defense. Roy chuckled, planning to outrun him after all. No, Nolan said, meeting his eyes. I'm planning to lead. By midday, the forge roared with purpose. Roy and Nolan worked like men, possessed, shaping iron, planing wood, threading leather into the skeleton of a vehicle no one in town had seen before. Not just a cart, not a wheelchair. A hybrid born of survival and intent. Outside, Clay arrived on horseback, a grim look on his face. Jessup's men have made camp out near Red Hollow. They've been seen talking to rail workers, probably bribing them to turn blind eyes. Tala joined them, her arms folded, dust smudging her apron. They're testing our boundaries. No, Nolan said, not looking up from the weld. They're testing mine. Clay leaned against the post. You sure you're up for this? Nolan didn't answer right away. He pressed the iron into the wheel arch, adjusted the curve sparks, hissing against his gloves. Then without turning, he said, I spent years thinking I was broken. Then I spent months pretending I wasn't. But I was never broken. I was just rerouted. Roy gave a low laugh of approval. That's what a wheel does. It turns, no matter what direction. Tala placed a hand on Nolan's shoulder, firm. You're not doing this alone. He nodded, knowing she meant more than just the forge. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the town, a whistle echoed through the canyon. The evening train crawled into Arroyo Wells, and with it came two new figures, one tall and lean, the other stout and humming tunelessly as he walked. Nolan watched them from the porch. Friends of yours, Tala asked. Letters I sent weeks ago, Nolan said. Didn't know if they'd ever arrive. The first man removed his hat. His face was sun-lined, his eyes calm. Sheriff Brennan. Retired. You must be Nolan. And you must be the man who still keeps his Colt polished, despite retirement, Nolan said, shaking his hand. The other man, Big Mose, gave Nolan a slap on the back that nearly jolted him from the chair. Heard you were building an army. Thought I'd sign up before the shootin' started. Tala arched a brow. Are you an army, more like a cannonball with a beard? Mose said with a grin. Nolan smiled a real one and nodded toward the half-built carriage. Grab a hammer. War's coming early. That night around the fire behind the forge, Nolan spoke for the first time about the night he was shot. How Holt Jessup had cornered him outside the saloon in Junction Ridge. How he'd told Nolan to forget what he saw. How the marshal's son had taken part in robbing that church caravan, leaving innocents for dead. How Nolan hadn't looked away. And for that, Nolan said he took my legs, my dignity, and tried to take my voice. Moses' face darkened. And now he wants to finish the job. No, Nolan said, eyes on the flames. He wants to prove no one can stand against him. But I've been sitting for years, and I'm still here. The fire crackled between them, but no one spoke. Because in that moment, Nolan's quiet defiance became something greater, something larger than revenge. It became a rally. Days passed with the sound of hammers and whispers spreading across Arroyo Wells. Tala coordinated with Clay and the ranchers. Children were taught to signal with lanterns, and old folk offered their homes as lookouts. Brennan repaired his rifle. Mose built a barricade near the town edge. Roy sharpened tools like they were blades. And Nolan refined the carriage. It gleamed like a metal heart, low strong, reinforced with interlocked ribs of ash wood and iron. Lever-driven, windshield hinged, room for a rifle holster, compartments for flares. It wasn't made to run. It was made to endure. The evening before Jessup was expected, Nolan rolled it out into the main street. The townsfolk gathered silently, staring at the creation. Not quite a war machine, not quite a symbol. Something in between. He turned to them all, his voice steady. They're coming to silence one man, but they'll have to silence a town. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. No cheers. Just resolve. Then Brennan stepped forward. They'll ride in at dawn, like they always do. Dust first, then bullets. Nolan nodded. Then we meet them with more than dust. That night the town didn't sleep. Tala found Nolan under the stars, testing the wheel alignment again. You should rest, she said. So should you. She stepped close. I've lost enough in my life. But I'm not losing you. Nolan looked up at her, her silhouette outlined by moonlight. You won't. Because I'm not that man anymore. She knelt beside him, cupped his face in her hands. Then show them who you are now. He pressed his forehead to hers. I thought I was just the man in the chair, but I was always the wheel that kept turning. And as the stars turned overhead, so did the town, bracing, waiting, and ready to turn the tide. Don't let my wheels fool you. I didn't come here to run. The dawn broke dry and red over Arroyo Wells, the kind of light that warned of blood before the first shot was ever fired. Dust clung low to the ground, curling like smoke around boots and wagon wheels. Silence hung heavy across the main street, broken only by the occasional creak of a shutter or the rustle of leather as townsfolk readied themselves behind barrels and broken fences. Nolan sat alone in the center of the street, positioned in his reinforced carriage, no longer the man in the chair, but the eye of the storm. He had strapped on his old coat, the one he'd worn before the shooting, its worn shoulders lined with the faint memory of badges and duty. His rifle lay in a cradle beside his leg, easily within reach, but it was the steel in his gaze that made him look like a man armed to the teeth. Tala approached from behind, resting a hand on his shoulder. You're sure this is the place to be if they think I'm hiding? Nolan said they'll think this town is weak. She knelt beside him, adjusting the strap on his boot. You're not weak. Just make sure they don't mistake your spine for surrender. He gave her a faint smile. That's the plan. From the church steeple, Brennan signaled with a glint of mirror 3 flashes. Clay's voice rang out low from the saloon. Riders on the ridge. 10. No more than 12. Nolan gripped the side lever of his carriage and eased it forward. His wheels turned with a smooth hiss, the modified spokes absorbing the uneven terrain. He moved down the street alone, deliberate, until he stopped dead center in front of the general store. Jessup's gang crested the far hill in a slow, arrogant wave, faces half-shadowed by their hats. Rifles slung casual across their chests, as if they were out for a lazy morning ride. Holt Jessup led them high in the saddle, his face smug and certain, as though the outcome had already been carved in stone. "Look who's rolled out to greet us," Holt called, reining in his horse, the tin marshal himself. Nolan said nothing, letting the silence stretch, letting the wind speak. Jessup scanned the buildings. "You hiding folks behind them windows again. Thought you were smarter than that." "They're not hiding," Nolan answered calmly. "They're watching." Jessup's eyes narrowed. "Still talking like you've got something left to threaten me with." "I don't have to threaten you," Nolan said. "Just stop you." That got a laugh from a wiry man behind Jessup's sloppy hat teeth like yellow dice. "You gonna stop us with that fancy chair?" Nolan pressed the side lever. The front shield on the carriage unfolded, locking in place with a quiet snap. The metal glinted sharp in the sun, catching Jessup's eye. "I didn't come here to run," Nolan said, voice low. "This town is under my watch again. And if you're here to break it, you'll have to break me first." Jessup's smirk faded. "You always were too proud for your own good." He raised a hand. A gunshot cracked from the rooftop across the street, Brennan's rifle. One of Jessup's riders dropped backward off his saddle before he even drew. Chaos erupted. Shots fired from both sides. Nolan dropped behind the shield as bullets pinged against the steel. Clay popped up from behind the saloon doors, his shotgun bucking flame. Tala darted between buildings, drawing return fire away from the homes. Roy and Mose took up the flanks near the forge, working in tandem, covering the eastern alley. Jessup's gang scrambled for cover, surprised by the resistance. Townsfolk who hadn't held a gun in years fought like they had nothing left to lose, and maybe they didn't. What Nolan had rebuilt here wasn't just a sense of justice. It was dignity. A reason to hold the line. Nolan wedged in the middle of it. All pulled his rifle and fired through a slot in the shield. His first shot winged a man trying to flank Tala. The second shattered the reins of a rider bearing down on the church steps. He was surgical, focused, but not invincible. A bullet ricocheted off the side of the carriage and grazed his shoulder. Nolan flinched, swore under his breath, and ducked lower. Blood seeped into the lining of his coat, warm and sharp. "You all right?" Tala shouted from across the road. Still rolling, he gritted out. Jessup, meanwhile, had dismounted and was weaving through the dust and debris toward the blacksmith's shed. He aimed to flank Nolan, cut through the chaos, and finish what he started years ago. But Mose saw him first. With a roar, Mose tackled one of Jessup's men, driving him into the wall of the feed store. He turned in time to see Jessup raising his revolver and bellowed, "Left side, Nolan." Nolan swung the carriage, pivoting fast. Jessup fired, but the bullet bounced harmlessly off the reinforced side. Nolan raised his rifle and fired, hitting Jessup in the thigh. The man fell howling. Nolan advanced the wheels, crunching over broken glass and scattered shell casings. He came to a halt just feet away, aiming down. "Time was I believed in men like you," Nolan said, voice level. "But now I see men like you only know power if it comes from fear." Jessup's eyes flared with hatred. "You're nothing. Half a man in a chair." "No," Nolan said. "I'm a whole man in a town that remembers what justice looks like." From behind him, Tala appeared, pistol in hand, blood on her sleeve, but steady as stone. "Do it," she said softly. Nolan lowered the rifle. "No. Let the law do what I couldn't do back then." Brennan stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "He'll stand trial, and he won't ride his way out of this one." Jessup spat blood and dust, but didn't fight. His gang, defeated and scattered, had either fled or were groaning in the dirt. The town had won. As the gunfire quieted and smoke lifted, the people of Arroyo Wells began to emerge, wide-eyed children, weathered elders, ranch hands, and widows, all of them looking to Nolan. He turned his carriage slowly, meeting their gaze. His face was bruised, his shirt torn, his blood mingling with the earth. But he held his head high. "You all stood today," he said. "Not for me, but for yourselves." Roy raised a hand in salute. "Damn right." Murmurs of pride and awe rippled through the crowd. Brennan and Clay began tending to the wounded, escorting Jessup and the remaining men into the makeshift jail. The people gathered in knots, checking on one another, counting their blessings and their losses. Tala came to Nolan's side. "You didn't have to be the one in front." "I did," he said, "because I was the one who used to ride away." Her fingers brushed his, quiet and warm. "Not anymore." As the sun climbed higher, the town began its slow return to peace. But in the back of Nolan's mind, something stirred, unfinished business, unsettled scores. He looked toward the horizon. The battle had been won. But peace, like steel, still needed shaping. You don't get to rewrite the truth just because it makes you uncomfortable. The air in the Arroyo Wells town hall was thick with heat and judgment. The meeting had been called under the pretense of restoration and reconciliation, but it quickly felt more like a public inquisition. Nolan sat near the front, still bruised from the gunfight, one arm in a sling, and his chair positioned slightly off-center, unintentionally symbolic of how everyone seemed to see him. Not quite fitting, not entirely welcome. Mayor Caldwell stood at the front, with her usual air of soft civility masking iron control. "It's time," she said, tapping the papers she held against the podium, "to talk about how we move forward." The violence last week was a wake-up call, and while many of us appreciate the courage shown, we must also acknowledge the disruption and cost. Nolan raised his eyes but said nothing. Tala, seated beside him, leaned in close. "They're about to spin it." He nodded. He could feel it in the shift of the room, in the way a few townsfolk avoided his gaze, in the tight smiles that disappeared too fast. A man named Wilkes, a merchant with connections to the surrounding ranchers, stood. "There's no question the town fought back bravely," he began, "but we also have to be realistic. Jessup's men were a symptom, not the disease. We can't afford to be a battleground again. And frankly, Marshal Nolan's presence, however well-intentioned, invites confrontation. Maybe it's time we consider what's best for all." A few heads nodded. Nolan sat still, jaw tight. Caldwell followed up. "We're not questioning your integrity, Marshal, but the question is whether your continued presence helps or hinders our stability." Tala stood before Nolan could. "So let me get this straight. You're saying that because he defended this town, because he bled for it, it's now his fault that danger came knocking. That's not justice. That's cowardice wrapped in a pretty speech." Wilkes stiffened. "With all due respect, Miss Rainwater, we're not saying that. We're saying the town needs to be pragmatic. The reality is, Nolan's condition complicates things. He can't patrol the outer ridges. He can't ride with the posse. If more trouble comes, we need someone who what Tala shot back. Who walks like you, who looks the part but folds under fire." Silence swept through the room like a wave. No one dared meet Nolan's eyes. He finally spoke, voice measured but edged. So you'd rather replace the man who stopped Jessup's gang with someone who's less complicated? That's your idea of moving forward. We're thinking about the future, Caldwell replied. This town is rebuilding. It needs to project strength, not division. Nolan's fingers gripped the armrest. You're mistaking comfort for strength. You want someone who doesn't remind you of what it cost. That's not leadership. That's erasure. Clay stood near the back, arms crossed, voice booming. He's the reason we're sitting in this hall and not buried out in Boot Hill. If he's not good enough for Arroyo Wells, maybe the problem isn't him. The murmurs grew louder, some in agreement, others uncomfortable. Brennan stepped forward next, setting his hat on the bench beside him. I've ridden with Nolan. I've seen him command under fire. You know what? I didn't see weakness, not once. You want someone who can ride fine, but don't you dare call him less than a leader because he doesn't ride the way you do. Wilkes scowled. That may be noble, but it doesn't change the facts. Tala crossed the aisle slowly, her boots tapping deliberately on the wooden floor. She stopped in front of the mayor's table. You want facts? Here's one. You didn't ask this town what it wanted before Jessup came. You didn't stand up when people needed help. Nolan did. And you know what else he did? He gave people their voice back. You want to take that away now because you're scared of what it looks like. Caldwell kept her expression neutral, but her silence said plenty. Tala turned to face the room. You all want stability. So do I. But stability built on exclusion, on fear of difference, that doesn't last. We've all seen what happens when you look the other way, hoping trouble just rides on through. Trouble doesn't. It camps out until someone makes it leave. A hush fell again. Then Mose stood. I've lived here near 30 years. I seen good marshals and bad ones. Nolan's the only one who asked me what I thought before telling me what to do. He's got my vote. That cracked the tension. Others began speaking up, Esther from the bakery, Luis from the livery. Even little Ella's mother, who had hidden her daughter in the root cellar during the shootout. I never trusted lawmen before Nolan, she said. But he made my girl feel safe. That's worth something. In the end, the vote wasn't taken formally. It didn't need to be. The room shifted on its own. Caldwell sighed, realizing the momentum had turned. Very well. Marshal Nolan remains. But let the record show this council reserves the right to revisit the matter. As the meeting dispersed, Nolan rolled his chair toward the door, shoulder-burning heart heavier than it had been on the battlefield. Tala walked beside him. You all right? No, he said. But I will be. Still want this job. He paused, then looked out across the town square where kids were chasing each other under the morning sun, where the saloon's busted windows had been replaced, and where an old couple had begun sweeping debris off the sidewalk. Yes, he said. Not because they deserve it, but because they need someone who doesn't quit when it gets ugly. Tala smiled. Then you're right where you should be. Before they reached the door, Brennan caught up a folded letter in his hand. This came for you. From the Capitol. Nolan took it, eyes narrowing at the seal. He broke it open, scanned the lines. Well? Tala asked. They're sending an inspector, he said flatly, to review the town's security. And me. Sounds like the real fight's just getting started. Nolan slipped the letter into his coat. Then I hope they bring a chair, because I'm not going anywhere. You don't put out a fire by pretending it ain't there, you face it or you let it burn everything down. Nolan's hand trembled slightly as he poured the coffee, a subtle betrayal of the tension boiling beneath the surface. The letter from the Capitol had arrived 2 days ago, and while its words were couched in formalities, Its purpose was clear: the state wanted a report, an inspection, and more than likely, a replacement. They were sending someone to determine whether Arroyo Wells and its marshal could still be trusted with law and order. It was nearly sunrise when the stagecoach rattled into town. Dust curled around the wheels like old ghosts unwilling to settle. The door creaked open, and a man stepped down. He was trim clean and had the kind of suit that never quite fit into dusty towns like Arroyo Wells. His name was Calvin Merritt, and everything about him said pencil pusher, except his eyes. Those were sharp and unreadable. Nolan met him in front of the sheriff's office, hand outstretched. Marshal Nolan Rawlins. Merritt looked at the hand, then shook it briefly. Inspector Calvin Merritt. I won't take much of your time. You've already taken 2 days of my nerves. Might as well stay a while. Merritt gave a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'll begin my review today. Deputies, record-keeping, patrol schedules, civilian relations. I expect full transparency. Nolan nodded. Of course. Inside the office, Merritt flipped through reports, asked questions about ammunition usage during the Jessup raid, and noted every answer with clinical detachment. Brennan hovered nearby, his irritation barely masked. Seems like he's looking to pin you to a wall, he muttered under his breath. Nolan's voice was even. He's looking to be convinced. We'll show him the truth. Merritt joined them on patrol through the town, taking notes as Nolan directed a few deputies, including young Eli, to check the northern ridge. On the walk, Merritt said little occasionally, stopping to speak with townsfolk. At the general store, he asked Esther how safe she felt. Safer than I've ever been, she said without hesitation. Marshal Rawlins looks out for us. At the livery, Luis crossed his arms. He got shot and still came back the next morning. That says more than any ledger you're holding. But not everyone was as supportive. Wilkes, always looking for leverage, cornered Merritt near the well. I respect law, he said, but let's be honest. Rawlins is a symbol of trouble. His condition slows him. His history draws enemies. This town needs someone without baggage. Merritt scribbled something, not nodding, not disagreeing, just listening. By mid-afternoon, Merritt had compiled enough pages to bind a small book. He sat outside the boarding house porch, reviewing his notes when Tala approached. Mind if I sit? She asked. He gestured to the bench. You've seen his limp, his chair, the way he leans on others when he's worn down. What you haven't seen is what this town was like before him. Merritt looked up. And what was that afraid? Splintered. Some folks too scared to speak up. Some too angry to care who got hurt. Nolan didn't just bring law, he brought balance. I'm not here to take sides, Merritt said. That's the lie people tell themselves when they're already on one. He didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. Later that evening, Nolan sat alone in the jailhouse. The town had gone quiet, too quiet. He stared at the wall, listening to the soft ticking of the clock, the distant howl of a coyote, and the silent weight of waiting. The door creaked open. Clay entered, rifle slung face tight. We've got trouble. Nolan straightened. What kind? 2 riders came into Josie's ranch from the North Canyon, not locals. Spooked the horses. Josie said they looked like scouts. Nolan's heart clenched. Jessup's remnants, or worse. If they're sizing up the town, we're in for a storm. Merritt, who had been shadowing Nolan all day, appeared behind Clay. If you think this is retaliation, we should notify the state marshals. They'll take too long, Nolan said. If this is something coming down now, we've got to prepare ourselves. Merritt folded his arms. Your injuries, your limited mobility. You can't possibly lead a defense. Watch me, Nolan said, standing with the help of his cane. And this time, we're not just defending, we're ending it. Clay looked to Merritt. You want to know what kind of man Nolan is. He doesn't wait for someone else to bleed first. He leads. Nolan issued orders fast and clear. Tala was sent to organize the women and children to shelter in the church cellar. Brennan and Eli rode to gather riders on the southern trail. Josie hardened from years of running her ranch. Solo arrived with her shotgun slung across her shoulder. They come, they'll regret it, she muttered. By nightfall, the town was bracing. Lanterns were dimmed. The saloon had been cleared. Sheriff's office locked. Every able-bodied man and woman stood ready, and Nolan, leaning against the doorframe, stared out into the dark plains. Merritt approached quieter now. This wasn't part of my inspection. No, Nolan replied, but this is the part that matters. A few moments later, a shot rang out in the distance. Everyone froze. Clay lifted his rifle. North Ridge. Nolan nodded. Let's finish this. As they rode out into the night, Merritt watched Nolan command every movement, pain obvious in his gait, but nowhere in his voice. The inspector looked down at his notes, then folded them shut. Some things he realized weren't meant to be measured by ink and paper. They were proven in fire. I didn't stay to be saved, I stayed because you never asked me to pretend I was whole. Smoke coiled into the night air like warning signals no one needed to interpret. Josie's barn was ablaze. The riders who had slithered into Arroyo Wells under cover of darkness had done more than scout, they'd ignited the first strike. By the time Nolan and his team reached the ridge, the flames painted the sky in a vicious orange. Nolan steadied himself in the saddle, the pain in his leg burning just as fierce, but his eyes didn't leave the horizon. Clay and Brennan flanked him, rifles drawn, while Eli crouched low, checking tracks. Merritt stayed behind at the main street, coordinating with Tala to keep the townsfolk safe. They lit the barn and pulled back, Clay said. They're trying to draw us out, and we're going to let them think it worked. Nolan replied, his voice steady. Eli pointed toward the west tree line. Fresh hoofprints, 4 sets. They're circling the creek trail. If they double back, they'll come in through the canyons near old Lathrop's place. Then we cut through Pinyon Pass, Nolan said. Flank 'em before they think they're ghosts. Clay hesitated. You sure you're up for that terrain? I'm not. Nolan answered, already nudging his horse forward. But I'm not sending anyone where I won't go myself. They moved fast the trail through Pinyon Pass, barely wide enough for the horses. Scrub brush snagged at their legs, and rocks slid under hoof, but no one spoke. The silence was thick with purpose. At the far ridge, they dismounted, creeping toward the overlook that gave view to the canyon floor. Sure enough, the riders were there, 4 of them huddled around a dying fire, one keeping watch. They weren't the same as Jessup's lot. These men were quieter, more organized, but their scars and gear spoke of lives lived far from peace. Nolan raised a hand, signaling stillness. He turned to Brennan. Circle around. Clay, give cover from that boulder. Eli, stay with me. What's the plan? Eli whispered. We interrupt their evening, Nolan muttered. They moved as one. The confrontation was swift, sharp, and loud bullets tearing through the silence. 2 of the riders fled, one injured the other, limping on foot. One fell where he stood, the last was caught trying to mount up. When it ended, dust hung in the air like a breath held too long. The captured rider, barely 20, sneered through bloody teeth. You think this ends it, no, Nolan said, but it's the beginning of the end. They returned to Arroyo Wells before sunrise, dragging the prisoner behind a tethered horse. Josie met them at the edge of town, her face streaked with soot and fury. That barn was my winter stock, she said, voice cracking. We'll rebuild it, Nolan said. together. Inside the sheriff's office, Merritt watched them enter. He looked from Nolan to the prisoner and said nothing for a long moment. "Why didn't you wait for reinforcements?" he finally asked. "Because we're the ones who live here," Nolan said, "and we're not waiting to be saved." Merritt nodded slower this time. "I've sent my recommendation to the state. You'll see it soon. I'm staying a little longer to file the formal report." The prisoner wasn't quick to talk. Brennan tried intimidation, Clay tried silence. It was Tala who got him to open up. She brought him water, treated the gash on his arm, and asked about his mother. "She died in Canyon Cross," he said. "Winter got her." Tala nodded. "That wind doesn't play fair." "You're not like them," he murmured. "I'm not supposed to be." He confessed that more were coming, traveling light-skilled, hired by a man who wanted Arroyo Wells for something beneath its soil. He didn't know the man's name, only the promised good money for forcing out settlers, for making the town look unfit for survival. Nolan stood listening from the corner. His jaw tightened. It's not about Jessup. It never was. This is bigger. Brennan looked at him. "So what do we do?" "We prepare for war," Nolan said, "but we fight like a family." That afternoon, the church bell rang, not for a sermon, but a call to arms. The town gathered, every man and woman standing shoulder to shoulder. Even the children sensed the shift in air. Fear had turned into fire. "We've been pushed, bruised, nearly broken," Nolan said, standing atop the church steps. "But we're still here. And we're not going anywhere." Luis raised a calloused fist. "They'll regret stepping foot in Arroyo Wells." And yet, as the cheers died down, Nolan's gaze lingered on Tala at the edge of the crowd. She was quiet, expression unreadable. Later, under the cottonwood behind the boarding house, Nolan found her sitting alone. "I saw your leg," she said, not turning to look. "After the ride, you were shaking." "I always shake after fights," he replied. "Doesn't mean I stop." She faced him. "I didn't stay to be saved, I stayed because you never asked me to pretend I was whole." Nolan swallowed. "I never thought you were broken." Tala's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "That's why I stayed. They didn't touch. They didn't have to." The truth between them was louder than any confession. The next morning brought another letter, this one unsigned, left under the door of the saloon. A warning: you were supposed to fall easy. The next wave won't miss. Nolan crumpled the note in his fist. War wasn't coming. It had already begun. They didn't just try to burn our town, they forged it in fire. Smoke no longer choked the skies of Arroyo Wells, but the memory of flame hung in the air like an unspoken prayer. The second wave of attackers had come with military precision, masked by the cold silence of dawn. They struck from the north and east, underestimating the resolve of a town that had learned to bleed together. Nolan stood near the edge of the cratered church wall, rifle slung across his back, his coat burned at the hem. The battle had lasted nearly an hour. The scars it left would endure longer. Bodies had been cleared. The dead on both sides lay under canvas, waiting for burial or identification. Tala moved among the wounded in the sanctuary-turned-field hospital, her apron streaked with blood that wasn't all hers. Nolan watched her pause beside the cot of young Levi, whispering something only the boy heard. He smiled despite the bandages. Josie stepped beside Nolan, handing him a flask of bitter black coffee. "If this is what it means to belong," she said, "remind me to write a very strongly worded letter to God." Nolan smirked, but his eyes stayed on Tala. "They came to gut us," he said, "and instead they carved out everything weak and left only what we need." "You think this is the end of it?" "No," he answered, "but it's the turning." After burying the fallen under the cottonwoods, Merritt called a town meeting inside the saloon, now one of the few standing communal structures. The bar had become a table for town records and maps. The piano held a rifle. Nolan stood before the crowd, his cane resting against the broken footrail. The weight in his leg was worse, but he stood straight. Tala sat in the corner, arms crossed, her gaze unreadable. "They didn't just try to burn our town," Nolan began. "They forged it in fire." Luis banged the table, "And we're still standing." "We're not just standing," Nolan continued. "We're building. We survived because we stopped waiting for someone else to defend what's ours. We stood like people who knew the worth of our land, our lives, and each other." He looked around the room, face by face. Jessup is dead. His men are scattered. The ones who hired them, they're still out there. But they know now what Arroyo Wells is made of, and if they come again, a voice called from the back, they'll find a town ready. "Not because of me," Nolan said, "but because of all of you." Merritt stepped forward, then unfolding a sheet of paper. "This just came through this morning. Official word from the governor's office." He looked directly at Nolan. "You're appointed full sheriff of Arroyo Wells. Not interim, not acting. You're it." A hush fell, then scattered applause. Nolan's mouth opened, then closed again. Tala was the first to stand and clap, her palms coming together like thunder. That night, as stars draped over the ridgeline, the town held a quiet celebration. No dancing, no music. Just food lanterns and stories told around the fire pit. Every plate shared felt like a promise. Every smile a scar turned sacred. Nolan found Tala near the old barn's foundation, her hands dusted in flour from rolling biscuits. She looked up when he approached. "I'm told I have a badge now," he said. She smiled. "About time they recognized what you've been doing. Only works if I have someone to keep me upright," he said. "I already do," Tala said. "You." They stood there, the sounds of laughter rising behind them like smoke, a balm after battle. "You ever think," she asked, "how this started? A stranger. A contract. A letter. Now all of this." "Mail order husband," Nolan said with a crooked grin. "Best damn decision you ever made." "And the riskiest," she replied. "You could have been a scoundrel." "I am," he said. "Just the kind who builds fences instead of breaking them." She leaned against him, then the weight of her small but solid. "I want to rebuild the school. With windows this time. And a proper roof," he said. "Maybe benches that don't give splinters. I want to raise goats," she added. "And you're going to help me." He groaned. "Goats, goats. You ask too much of a man with a bad leg." "You stood for a town," she said quietly. "You'll manage a few goats." They sat under the stars until the fire burned down to red glow embers. As they rose, Tala took his hand. "Don't let them forget," she whispered. "I won't," he said, "because I won't forget." The next morning, Nolan rode to the northern ridge overlooking the desert road. A dust trail curled along the horizon, just wind, no riders. Still, he sat watching. Behind him, the town had already begun hammering boards, mixing clay setting stones for foundations. Children chased chickens between stacked crates. Brennan shouted at Luis for painting over a good door. Clay was teaching Levi how to clean a rifle. Merritt had left, promising to return before winter, and Tala, barefoot and scowling, was arguing with Josie about porch paint. Nolan smiled, adjusting the badge pinned to his vest. They came to break them. But Arroyo Wells didn't shatter. It became. The educational lesson learned from this story is that true strength is not always visible at first glance. It lies in the choices we make to protect, uplift, and stand by others, even when it's inconvenient or painful. When we look past labels, limitations, and society's definitions of worth, we often discover people of great integrity and purpose. In a world that often praises independence, this story reminds us of the quiet power in community love and shared resilience. Especially later in life, it's never too late to forge new beginnings and deepen our values through acts of courage, compassion, and trust.